Welcome to Represent the Vote. I'm your host, Karen Finney. Thank you so much for joining us for this three-part series of conversations about the issues that will directly impact our community this 2020 election and beyond. We're going to be talking about the issues so that you have the information that you need when you go to vote. Now, this is an unprecedented election. We're still in the middle of a COVID pandemic that has killed more than 200,000 Americans, and more than 7 million Americans have been infected with the virus. And as we know, Black and Brown Americans have been and continue to be impacted disproportionately as the pandemic rages. In the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd and the killing of Breonna Taylor and far too many Black men and women, we are again at a generational moment of racial reckoning. Systemic racism has been laid bare in the bones of our economy, our healthcare system, and our economic system, impacting every area of our lives. And as Americans continue to take to the streets in passionate protest for justice, will their cries finally inspire action? And what should be done to hold those in elected office accountable for the campaign promises that they're making to us right now? We've got a lot to unpack, and I'm excited to introduce our guests for this discussion. Here to talk about these policy decisions that have a direct impact on Black women, our families, and our communities, please join me in welcoming Reverend Shavon Arline-Bradley. She's the president and founding principal of R.E.A.C.H Beyond Solutions, a faith, advocacy, executive leadership, and public health firm. Shavon is co-founder of the Health Equity Cipher Group, a collaborative of nationally recognized health experts designed to promote health, equity, and inclusion in all sectors. Lia Epperson is the professor of law at American University, Washington College of Law, a nationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights, constitutional law, and education policy. Dr. Avis DeWeever, an award-winning author, international speaker, media commentator, political strategist, and co-founder and CEO of Max Black Media. And finally, Shermichael Singleton. He is a writer, a commentator, and political consultant, host of ABC WJLA's Global Perspective in Washington, D.C. He's worked on the presidential campaigns of Newt Gingrich, Mitt Romney, and Dr. Ben Carson. Thank you all so much for joining me for this really important conversation. I'm going to dive right in. And Lia, I'm going to start with you because, as we mentioned, the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg has left a vacancy on the court, which President Trump has nominated a judge to replace. We expect over the next several weeks we will see that nomination unfold. But can you lay out for folks, what does that really mean? Why does that matter to us as we are going to the polls? And what's at stake when we think about the Supreme Court?
Karen, I think when you ask what's at stake, I would say everything is at stake. We're really at a point where our democracy is at a crossroads. With the passing of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, it's not only the notion of how the substance will change in our courts, but even the process by which we've come here. So we have a president who has publicly stated that he may not acquiesce to a peaceful transition of power should he lose the presidential election. And what we do know is if there is a contested election, the place where that contest goes are our courts. So he is further politicizing the process by choosing the person who should go on the court in the midst of a presidential election, which, early voting's already started. So we really are in the midst of a presidential election. This is contrary to the precedent that the Senate set 4 years ago. When they said we should wait until after an election. We should listen to the will of the American people. So the process is really going against the will of the people and really undermining the legitimacy of the court itself. So there's a really big red flag with that. But even beyond that, you're correct that in terms of the substance of what's happening with the court, we really are at a critical juncture. We have, between Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's passing and the nomination of Judge Amy Coney Barrett, a possible largest ideological shift, I would say, since Thurgood Marshall stepped down and Clarence Thomas took over. And when you wonder what's at stake, it's everything that you can think of that we hold dear with respect to civil and human rights. It is healthcare, reproductive rights, voter protection, election laws, labor laws, employment, you name it, it is touched by this, and certainly a whole host of things in education.
Talk about what's at stake with the Affordable Care Act in this case, and sort of what does that mean for Black America right now?
Well, Karen, thanks for the question. What's so important for really our listeners to remember is that the Affordable Care Act was signed into law in March of 2010. So we're talking about 10 years of a piece of legislation that has literally changed the face of healthcare. If we're thinking about the Supreme Court justice, though, what's important to know is at stake is that issues like pre-existing conditions, looking at mandates in terms of individual mandates, these are issues that will come again before this court. And what makes this so polarizing is that we are talking about adjusting a healthcare law in the midst of a pandemic. If you look at the data, African Americans between the years of 2010 and 2016 saw the largest decrease in uninsured populations. Now, what has happened between 2017 and 2018, those numbers have begun to creep up. And what is at stake now is really thinking through how having a medical home can affect your ability to have access to the kinds of treatments that are going to help us with issues like COVID, with issues like heart disease and diabetes, where African Americans are unfortunately at the highest disproportionate numbers than any of our counterparts. So the Supreme Court justice is very much so connected to the healthcare fight in ways we could have never imagined.
Shermichael, I want to talk to you about something. I mean, COVID, it's with us. It's not going away anytime soon. And one of the things we've been talking about, or that we've been hearing about, is the vaccine. And we know that there are a number of trials in the works, and I think we're all hoping that we have a vaccine at the end of the year. It could be early next year. But most importantly, concerns about, given the sort of unique history that Black America has when it comes to like the Tuskegee experiment, and it comes to our representation in healthcare studies. How do you see that is impacting our ability to both be part of the test for these vaccines? And what does that mean for our community in terms of how we should be thinking about when there is a vaccine? How do we hold our leaders accountable to make sure that we're getting what we need?
Right. I think there's a natural propensity for African Americans to be concerned and a bit skeptical as it pertains to the government and anything as it pertains to health and other issues. And I think that's why, Karen, it's so important for the administration to not rush this process. The president has tweeted several times and even stated in various interviews and at rallies that we will have some type of a vaccine or some therapeutics within a matter of weeks, perhaps even before the election or immediately afterwards. And I would think, in understanding how lengthy that trial process typically is, that rushing this is probably not the best direction to go. With that said, I do think it is important for African Americans to be a part of that process. We are impacted disproportionately at a litany of categories. And it's not just African American women, it's also African American men, heart disease, hypertension, colon cancer. And so I think if we look at this holistically, I think we need to approach this slowly and steadily, allow the process to take its course, with many of the pharmaceutical companies continuously testing the process. But I think as they go through those various stages, we have to make sure that, one, African Americans are a part of the process, and two, that some of the preconditions that African Americans typically have are also a part of those trial series, so that once something does roll out, most African Americans can feel comfortable with taking it. And also, two, we need to make sure that as they're going through trials, that while something may work very well for white Americans, that's not necessarily certain that it'll do well with African Americans.
How do we motivate people, young people in particular, to continue to fight for affordable care for everyone? Because we know that, let's say the Affordable Care Act stays in place, there's still more work that needs to get done to make healthcare more accessible and affordable.
Absolutely. So, I think it's very important that people understand that, as important as voting is, and it is absolutely critically necessary, in the world of power and politics, voting is the starting line. It is not the finish line. So when you vote, that is just the beginning of your political engagement. What I would encourage everyone to do, from the youngsters all the way up to our most seasoned family members, is to make sure that your elected officials actually push through legislation that is congruent with your needs and your interests. And that certainly includes making sure that we expand access to healthcare, making sure that we make sure that healthcare is more affordable for everyone, making sure that we make sure that the prices associated with prescription drugs go down, making sure that we have access for Medicare and for Medicaid, making sure that the most vulnerable among us are covered. That is part of what we can do. Now, we do know that on the ballot is a vision for expanding the Affordable Care Act to really make sure that we expand Medicare and Medicaid specifically to individuals who need it and now have sort of dropped through the loophole that currently exists with the Affordable Care Act. So there is a lot that we can do. There is a lot that we must do. But we must not only vote for president, we must make sure that we have the senators in there. We must make sure that we have the representatives in there so it can get through all three branches of government that it needs to get to become law of the land.
All right, everybody, it's a great conversation. I want you to stay with us. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back. All right, I'm going to shift gears to the economy because this is really, I think, at the crux of it. It is at the crux of, with COVID, the impact on our economy. It's interesting, in recent polling, we're seeing that the economy is sort of racism and racial strife, and the economy are kind of the top two issues people are concerned about, and they really do go hand in hand. We know that our economy is in trouble, and whoever wins this election, I'm hoping it'll be a recovering economy because we will hopefully be on the other side. But we're going to need some real help. And here again, Avis, as we know, Black and brown families, we are the frontline workers.
Yes.
We are the ones who are working those jobs where a $15 minimum wage could make a real difference. The racial wealth gap, even before COVID, it's certainly been exposed, but even before COVID, this gap has persisted for decades. Mm-hmm. Some studies show that at the rate we're currently going, that gap will never close. And if we want to solve this problem, we need to accelerate the growth of Black wealth. So what are some of the realistic accelerators?
I mean, one of the things that I think is absolutely necessary is to be able to close that wage gap. When I say that, I mean that across both race and gender, because Black men, too, do not make wages on par with their white male counterparts. So we need to make sure that we close the wage gap in every form that it takes, because unless you have that extra income that you can then invest in wealth building vehicles, it's very hard for you to be able to grow wealth. We need to make sure that our Black businesses are supported. COVID has specifically attacked Black businesses in a very devastating way. It kind of reminds me about the crisis that we had with foreclosures just a few years back, where we lost roughly half of our wealth due to the foreclosure crisis. Now, on the back of COVID, we've lost roughly half of our businesses due to this crisis. Both of those took major chunks out of our wealth. We need to make sure that we provide access to capital and the support that our families need to be able to grow wealth by growing their businesses. And we also need to make sure that people do have an entree to home ownership so they can get on that path to growing equity and to be having stability in their lives, but also be able to grow wealth through that magic of owning their own homes that hopefully they can keep in their families for generations.
Oh, Shermichael, I want to talk about that for just a minute. I mean, there's a couple of things we'll come back to in terms of, raising the minimum wage, but this idea, talk a little bit about, it is so ingrained, I know, in my family, the idea of owning, my father started on me, like, you got to buy something, you got to own something. Is that still, for young people, though, in particular, who are so critical in this election, and young men and women, is that still perceived as the best way to attain wealth?
It's really, really difficult to think about and focus on buying your first home or your first condo when you're paying thousands of dollars a month in student loans. I mean, so for many young people, they're either renting extremely expensive apartments because they have to live in the city because that's where work is, or they're forced to move back home and live with their parents. I briefly served as the deputy chief of staff at HUD. And one of the issues that I was extremely alarmed about for my generation was that so many of us are not only purchasing homes later in life, we're starting families later in life. When you look at the crosstab relations of the data of why, the number one reason for most millennials was because student debt is an issue. And so I think before we can even have a conversation about building wealth, creating wealth, and then sustaining that wealth, which Dr. Avis just noted, so that you can pass it on to generation after generation, we have to make college education far more accessible. I think if that becomes more accessible, then you can sort of transition your lens to buying a home, creating that wealth. Then that transitions into passing it down from generation to generation.
So we're going to talk about education in our next section, but Lia, I want to come to you because I think this surfaces some really important points, obviously. Obviously, when we have students graduating with significant debt, it means they can't start a business, and it means it makes it harder to then, which is one way of attaining wealth, and home ownership. At the same time, we also know that part of the reason we have a racial wealth gap is that even when we own, our investments have less value. We know that some of these solutions are not taking actually into account the complexities of the wealth gap and sort of the intersectionality of what that means for Black families and Black people. So as if we think about automation in our economy, right, what are some of the new opportunities for job growth and economic development that Black parents ought to be thinking about steering their children?
Karen, that's a great question. And I almost feel like if I knew the exact way to do it, I could make sure that all of our kids were going to grow up and have the best possible path forward. But I think that you highlighted what the issue is, which is that if you combine this reality that we have, where we have a really disproportionate number of young people in our community who are experiencing this debt, because obviously, as Shermichael was mentioning, this student debt crisis is a crisis nationally. And it is true that most students are graduating with some form of debt. But we know that for Black students, we have an even more difficult path in obtaining this college education because of how we are targeted around for-profit colleges, for example. So when you're asking about what are the avenues, I think part of it is also trying to think and be strategic and as educated as possible about what path we choose in obtaining higher education. I think that we should think about it expansively, because you're correct that it may not be that the only path forward are a particular set of four-year liberal arts colleges, and this is the way to go. At the same time, I think our community is one that is really targeted for expensive for-profit colleges that aggressively market to students of color, to students who actually have less money, thinking this will be a more affordable path. And I do think we need to highlight that that is not the path to go down.
Stay right where you are. We're going to take a quick break, and then we'll be right back. Thanks for rejoining us. We are now back to this really important conversation. One of the things I want to talk about is we know that systemic racism and racial bias plays a role in the role that we are able to play in the economy. It particularly for Black women, it impacts the jobs we're able to get, the jobs that we are considered quote unquote qualified for. And there are some, in corporate world, there are strategies that people are starting to employ to try to create more awareness around those biases in hiring practices. But some people say that one way to cut through it all and to sort of give Black folks kind of a fair chance is reparations. And, there was a 2019 report by McKinsey that forecasted that if the wealth gap were closed, US GDP would be 4 to 6% higher by 2028. So if we literally just kind of dealt with the racial wealth gap, we could increase GDP. Why somebody isn't campaigning on that right now, I don't know. There was also a recent study from Citigroup that said racism has cost the U.S. economy $16 trillion in wage growth, in education access, home ownership, lending. All of these things combined that we're talking about. So reparations would allow for spending, but do we need to move beyond that conversation and to find out, again, to think about the other ways that we can prioritize closing the racial wealth gap?
So I think reparations is one part of the conversation, but I will tell you, we're into systems change in this time and place. One of the things that I've found is that as you think about consumer spending, African Americans in this country have one of the highest rates of consumer spending really amongst all of our counterparts. And what's important to note here is that our ability to spend is one thing, but our ability to accumulate wealth and to be able to sustain it and it become generational is another. And so this conversation around reparations to me is so interesting because, I mean, I'm here for the 40 acres and the mule, but what I will say is that we have to think about our power structures, right? Who's making decisions around where our investments and resources are going? Who are those that are in power that are able to identify, who gets capital, who has access to be able to buy those homes? I'm a Gen Xer at the end of Gen X, and we're probably that last generation that had to buy something before you're 30. Well, this has really been a part of our cultural experience as well, because in the Black community, our fellowship has been around ways that we're able to provide opportunities for our families. Reparations is one part of a larger discussion. How do we gain political power? How do we gain access to capital? And then how do we sustain wealth in our families, which then leads to productive lives, quality of life in terms of healthcare, education access, and beyond.
One of the many impacts we're seeing in COVID, frankly, is Black women, small businesses failing at higher rates. I mean, Black businesses, small businesses in particular, across the board are really suffering. But women, how do we, Avis, again, as I try to, when I vote, I'm trying to think about the future. I'm trying to think about who's the person who's got the ideas that are going to help get us out of this mess, but make sure that we can do a better job when we're not so focused on COVID. How should Black women, small business owners be thinking about and looking for those opportunities?
Yeah, I mean, this is, as you mentioned, a very precarious time. But Black women have been really the leading demographic historically for several years now in terms of starting our own businesses. And for years, we've been experiencing challenges like having businesses that, unfortunately, the revenue potential has not met that of other women-owned businesses. We also tend to be solopreneurs exclusively or longer than other businesses. And so all of that sort of keeps us small. But as you mentioned, during this time of COVID, it's especially dire because of the challenges that we're facing in our economy overall. I think generally speaking, what we need to look for in a candidate is someone who is interested in specifically in investing in Black businesses and making sure that Black women business owners have the support that they need to thrive, making sure that they have access to government contracts, for example, that will allow their businesses to have some stability over the long term, making sure that there are enforcement in terms of subcontracting, and make sure that Black businesses and Black women-owned businesses have access to those dollars that are out there circulating now in terms of implementing government contracts, for example. And so I think there are also several things that we can do just as a community, making sure that we are supporting those organizations, many of them nonprofits, who provide support and training and help to people who are interested in entrepreneurship. But the bottom line is this is a key piece that we cannot leave out of the economic pie if we want to make sure that our families can thrive economically.
All right, everyone, stay where you are. We'll be back in just a moment. College debt is something that is crushing entrepreneurship. It is crushing the ability of younger people to get ahead. So let's talk about education, because there's a lot of really interesting ideas that are out there right now. And again, this is an issue people can vote about.
I do think a restructuring of the debt is certainly something that should be a part of the conversation. And I do also think, and this is not a popular or traditional position in conservative circles, but that is that we may indeed have to forgive some debt for certain individuals. I think that should also be a part of the conversation. If not, I think we're going to end up having a balloon effect here. And like the housing market, student debt could very well be the next thing that significantly impacts the economy. I also think trade school should be something that we should focus on starting in high school. College is not for everyone. A traditional four-year liberal arts degree is not for everyone. I don't think there's a one size fit all, if you will. But I also think, after high school, if a student decides to go to college, from my position, if they're going to focus on a particular discipline area that we need more individuals in, and I think for African Americans, we need far more doctors, far more folks focusing on STEM. There's a considerable shortage of African American men and women in those fields, you should be able to attend school for free. I think it makes perfect sense. You're adding value to the overall community. It's adding value to the overall country. And so I think giving those opportunities to individuals who may not have the capability to afford to go to college, but may excel academically is something that we should consider.
Some of the things that you're mentioning, they really do begin at the K-12 level. It's about how do we invest in schools to create innovative programs that actually give kids the widest range of opportunities possible, not only one track, or for too many of our kids, no track. And I think that's the issue as well, that when you think about where funds are being distributed, this is a great vote, this is a great vote down ballot issue, because education is largely funded at the state level when we're talking about K-12 education. So when you think about what's happening in schools now, we have, similar to what Shavon was mentioning about a pandemic exacerbating health inequities, we have that happening very much at the education level. We already have a system in which we were suffering from a tremendous amount of, what we would call sort of double segregation, schools that are highly segregated by race, but also by poverty, so that Black and brown kids are most likely in schools that are in poor school districts with lower funding, less resources, fewer credentialed and experienced teachers, fewer access to what we would call advancement networks that teach them about higher education, whether it's a four-year college or a trade opportunity. And there are ways to begin those partnerships at the K-12 level to expose students to what might be available.
Shavon, so to that point, I mean, the other way that this is sort of being reflected in our community is we've got in education, we've got parents now having to be the educator.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. We are all there.
So in addition to holding down the job, you are now, the teacher. And certainly, as Lia just mentioned, I mean, we've been talking about, for example, the need for broadband across this country since, for 20, 30 years, right? Since the beginning of the internet when it was invented, right? So what are some of the other, from a policy perspective, what are some of the ways coming out of COVID, or, what are the fixes, the policies, the things we need to be, again, if we're going to ask for the receipts, if we're going to vote for people, and we're going to say, okay, what did you do? We want to hold them accountable. What are some of the things we want to be looking for in terms of education policy to try to close some of these gaps?
Absolutely. So as we're thinking about education policy, I think about net neutrality. I think about access to broadband immediately. And we were all laughing because I have a 6-year-old. I was not trained to be a first grade teacher. I was trained to be his mother. And so when you're thinking about advocating, I'm also thinking about teacher benefits. I'm a daughter of a retired principal. My brother's a first grade teacher in New Jersey. And I really now realize how our teachers have not been supported. So if we're thinking about policies, we need to think about long-term investments in teacher development and also diversifying the workforce of educators. There's another place also, and that is really in school health access. There's been a concerted effort to try to increase access to school nurses and even nurse practitioners and medical doctors in our schools. Now that we're not in schools, we're trying to find a way to connect healthcare access and healthcare education with our school systems. There's one more place, and that is the nutrition area with education. I will tell you, we are seeing a massive amount of trauma as it relates to school-aged children not having access to regular meals. And because of the CARES Act, because of some funds that come down originally, we started to see opportunities for meal availability. Well, this has to be a long-term investment. We cannot look at our children and let them suffer because we don't know the real story of the resources that are needed at home, because the school at this point have been supplementing and supporting a lot of families. I would say the last thing is thinking through this idea of in-person education and virtual education. What works in what communities? We have to take an assessment of how this is affecting Black children. I happen to have access, but my husband and I were going crazy because we did not know what we were doing, and we have college degrees. Right. That do not have that same access.
All right, everybody, it's a great conversation. I want you to stay with us. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back. there are a lot of ways that government can help support good policy by its own practices, right? Whether that is the $15 minimum wage, whether that is who we hire and how we hire, and sort of setting those examples. But one of the things we've seen in recent years, and you're an expert on this issue, is the attack that it's affirmative action, that somehow that when we do that, that somehow, that's unfair, even though we are competing in a system that is already unfair for Black businesses, and particularly Black women when we talk about access to capital. What are you seeing, and what can we expect in terms of those attacks on these ideas that we see it in education, we see it, again, around contracting, the impact of these attacks on affirmative action as a policy?
I will tell you, I think there's two tracks happening here. On the one hand, you have really what is the precedent in our courts? And so when you're asking about what is the precedent with respect to affirmative action, policies that actually have overwhelmingly helped women, more so even than Black people. And with respect to affirmative action in education, we have a series of Supreme Court cases that have stated very clearly it is absolutely constitutional for colleges and universities to have affirmative action plans that consider race as one of many factors in determining admissions for qualified students. And so it's one piece of an admissions pie, if you will. It contains all sorts of other things, like, does a kid come from an underrepresented part of the United States? Do they play a different instrument? What are they bringing to the table that is going to contribute to the diversity and vibrancy of that institution? And so we have opinions dating back from the 1970s, all the way through most recently to the Fisher decision. The court has upheld this principle. So from a constitutional perspective, that is pretty solid ground. At the same time, educationally, we do have there have been repeated attacks, often really coming from a sort of group of lawyers who are the same group launching repeated attacks, whether it's, Michigan or North Carolina or Texas, and so right now we do have a case from my alma mater, from Harvard. Their admissions policy is under attack. It's a case percolating through the courts. It's now at the U.S. It's the sort of appellate level. So one could imagine that will make its way up to the Supreme Court. And again, going back to the importance of this Supreme Court appointment, it will have an impact on affirmative action policies.
So can I just add, I think it's very important when fighting back these critiques around affirmative action and the degree to which the African-American community benefits. I think it's important that people know in a very sharp way that we benefit to this much less than the white population benefits with other programs that preference them. So as was mentioned, white women are actually the #1 demographic group that benefits from affirmative action, both in employment specifically. When we're talking about access to higher education, legacy admissions have a much greater influence on whether or not someone gets into college than do affirmative action programs. Who are the primary people that benefit from legacy admissions? I tell you, it's not us, okay? And so it really annoys me when people attack affirmative action because to me, this is the smallest slice of the pie. And there are others who are getting the lion's share of the pie, but no one has a problem with the unearned advantages that those populations receive, as opposed to this particular effort trying to at least balance the playing field just a bit.
Right.
And as I say to my students, Avis, those are affirmative action programs.
Absolutely.
Affirmative action programs.
All right, everyone, stay where you are. We'll be back in just a moment.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
are you
I'm
prepared
willing to do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it. You want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and white
Proud
militia.
Boys, stand back and stand by.
The first presidential debate was something of a hot mess inside a dumpster fire, as one person has called it. I'm not sure we learned a lot about policy, so I think that's part of why this conversation is so important, right? But one thing that happened was very important, I think, to my mind, and I think for our community, particularly in an election, and that is, when we think back to Charlottesville and we think back to those images of white supremacists carrying torches, and we think back to what that meant, and President Trump at that time saying that there were very fine people on both sides, and then sort of the arc of that to now, to this first presidential debate, when Trump was asked very specifically, will you denounce white supremacy? He could have even said white supremacist violence. I mean, there's a lot of ways he could have parsed it. And he refused. And as a Black woman, as I think about where we are in this country and the issues that we have just talked about, right, where systemic racism is part of COVID, it is part of our economy, it is part of education, it is part of our healthcare, to have a president in 2020 who won't denounce white supremacy, it was terrifying.
I think President Trump understands very, very clearly the type of signals and messaging that he typically articulates. And he understands how those things have resonance with certain groups of individuals within this country. I think for an individual who has looked at every single poll that all signal that he's likely going to lose, this is almost like a caged animal trying to escape. And I use that analogy, if you will, to suggest that this is a man who recognizes he probably will not win. And considering all of the things that he personally will likely have to deal with as it pertains to legal issues, he is going to send every single type of signal that may represent the worst of humanity in our country to those individuals in an effort to turn them out. And so that further means and highlights how important it is for people to vote. Vote in person if you can. If you're going to go the absentee route, make sure you follow every single direction, because I can absolutely guarantee you, after November 3rd, President Trump's reelection campaign will go to the most critical states, and they will contest those absentee ballots. I've worked on several presidential campaigns. I'm very familiar with this process. Once they go through that process, they will look at every single individual absentee ballot. If there is the slightest thing that is wrong on those ballots, they will slowly begin to discard them one by one. And so I think it's critically important for people not to understand the importance of voting, but also making sure you go through the process properly.
For me, I will say this: I have zero expectations from the current administration because we've seen this movie before. I know that voters that are listening, even to us speaking right now, need to understand the inability to speak against white nationalism, quite frankly, any kind of racist response to any issues, not only should be denounced, but should also be prosecuted. And I don't think we're having the conversation that we should be having, which is identifying for the president and those that are around him who can make an executive order that says diversity and inclusion is a bad thing. This is all in alignment. And I don't want our listeners to be confused. Follow the messaging, hear the undertones, watch the response. That's why you got hecklers at polls. That's why you have people that are now not afraid to call people the N-word in public, because there is no more shame. I am a preacher, so I pray on this, but I'm also a fighter. And I believe that the way to fight is to not only vote. I've signed up to be an election judge and a poll watcher, and I'm asking all of you, those that are members of faith houses, young people, members of civic organizations, we need to get involved. I am planning on standing there to count as many votes as my county will allow me to count.
Avis, thoughts from you on this one?
So I'm speaking to all of those who are active in our communities and may right now be discouraged. I want you to know that your vote matters, and do not let other people who are in your ear trying to suggest to you that it doesn't sink in. They are not your friend. They are not looking out for your interest. It's important that you vote not just for today and not just for the next 4 years, but for the implications that we will still be feeling for the next 40 years and beyond.
I cannot think of a more important presidential election in recent history. And so when people are saying, what can you do? It really comes down to the vote for the president, the vote for all of the Senate seats that are up, all the down ballot votes. And it's those three important pieces. It's ensuring you must register to vote as if your life depended on it. You must cast that ballot as if your life depended on it. And you have to make sure that that vote is counted. And that's what comes in with the poll watching, the elections, the counting, all of that. Those are three key pieces that each and every person should be focused on, again, as though our lives depend on it. Because if you think it can't get worse, it will if we don't do the things we need to do to stand up for our democracy.
All right. You know, Michelle Obama says, vote like your life depends on it. And guess what? It does. And that's why we're having these conversations. So I really want to thank you all so much for joining me for this critical discussion. And thank you all so much for tuning in. Now, next time, we're going to have a conversation about the power of the Black women's vote. And that is going to be a fun one. I'm Karen Finney. Please stay safe, and we'll see you next time.